Writing Out Loud, a program designed to explore in-depth interviews with writers to hear that words have voices.
Hello everyone, I'm Teresa Miller and welcome to Writing Out Loud. My very special guest today is Theasa Tuohy. Theasa's new book is The 5 O'Clock Follies. Welcome, Theasa.
Thank you.
You're a veteran journalist. What was it like when you first started out in the field?
Well, there weren't too many women around, that's for sure. But I just kind of decided I wanted to do it, and so I did it. I just kept pestering and banging on doors until, actually that's not even true. What happened really was that every time I got a good job, it's because some guy had just left or quit in a hurry. Certainly that was true when I became the first woman assistant city editor at the Detroit News. I had put in a resume, and they'd called me and offered me a job in the women's department, and I just sort of innocently said, well, I just don't think I could do that. I've never done anything but hard news. Mm-hmm. A week later, some guy that they had hired to be their night state editor called in the day he was supposed to start work and said he didn't want to come to Detroit after all when he found out that it was north of Canada. So they called me and said, can you do this? And I'm like, sure, why not?
You mentioned the women's department. What sort of stories did women cover mostly during
Well,
that
they
era?
were called society pages, and it was luncheons and weddings and I don't know, recipes, that sort of thing. I started out in the news department in a small paper just north of New York City, Yonkers. Mm-hmm. Again, I just sort of fell into it and kept hanging in there, and finally, when the guy that was supposed to be covering City Hall got sick, they sent me over to do that. So that's kind of the way it worked. When I went to when I wanted to leave Yonkers because they weren't paying me enough money and started looking around, I walked into the Newark Star-Ledger, and there were a whole bunch of old guys sitting there in white dress shirts and green eye shades, so help me. And when I walked in the building, I mean, it was just, everyone just sort of stared at me like, what's this woman doing here? Anyway.
We emphasize large newspapers so much. Are there special lessons to be learned on smaller newspapers, like the paper in Yonkers?
Oh, absolutely. That's really where you need to start, is so that you kind of learn everything and learn how to get your way around. I was in Paris just because I loved to hang out in Paris when I was young, and ran into a guy in the lobby of the sleazy hotel or the cheap hotel, it wasn't sleazy, where I was staying, and told him I wanted to get in the news business, and he gave me that piece of advice, and I'll never forget it. He said, you have to start someplace small and learn how to do all sorts of things, and that's precisely what I did in Yonkers. Once I got my foot in the door, then I covered this, covered that, covered City Hall, chased fire trucks, and finally I ended up actually working on the composing room floor, which was unheard of, totally unheard of. But the printers loved it. I mean, I was young and feisty, and I'd go up there and ask, well, how do you do this? How do you do that? How does this work? So I really, learned the business kind of from the ground up, so that by the time I got to a larger paper, I knew my way around.
What was driving you to be a journalist?
I thought it was fun. Well, you know, that's not really, I mean, I did it because it was fun and I wanted to do it because it was fun, but I think most journalists take their job very seriously. I mean, I think each and every one of us thinks we're preserving the Constitution or something by making sure that we try to get stories in the paper and try to find out what the truth of something really is, or as close as you can get to it. This is what, you know, my book is about. It's about the press and how they operate, and trying to set a dramatic, page-turning story in the northern suburbs of Detroit, you know, doesn't have a real dramatic ring to it. So I think that's why I chose Vietnam.
Yeah, we're gonna talk about that in some depth here in just a few minutes, but I want to get back to the Detroit News, and you're the first woman to be the assistant city news editor there. How were you accepted by your male colleagues? Were they comfortable having a woman making these assignments and decisions?
Yeah, the difficulty there were the young reporters more than the older guys. The fellows that had been in the business a long time, I think, could see that I knew what I was doing. And I got moved around to some extent. I started out as the night state editor. Nobody wanted to be on the overnight shift. And then at one point they put me on the rewrite bank, which is like unheard of. In the old days, I mean, the rewrite guys had to take a story, you know, instantly on the phone, and this is way before computers, and they'd, you know, a copy boy would rip a sheet of paper out of your typewriter as you started working on the next. And they put me on the rewrite bank for a 5-week shift when a guy that had been there forever was taking a long vacation. And that's one of the toughest things that I've ever been through. But the old guys on the rewrite bank were like really supportive of me. They could see I knew what I was doing, and they were helpful. I mean, because that's a tough gig. That was a lot tougher than being an assistant city editor. The hard part about being assistant city editor was I was in the zone section, which with a large paper like Detroit, there were zones for downriver, a zone for the northern suburbs, a zone for east, and then a zone for Detroit itself, for the city. And so I got all the really young green reporters, and that was rough. And my ex-husband at the time had been in the business forever and worked at the paper down the street, and when I would say these young kids, I mean, it's so hard to get them to pay any attention to me or listen to me or what, you know. And Louis just said, yeah, well, don't you think that's the way it is with everybody? And that was a fantastic lesson to not be too self-conscious, not that I had been up to that point anyway about being a woman. And it turned out when I was ready to leave there 8 years later that all these young guys that I had sort of brought up and helped along sort of told me then, 8 years later, why didn't you tell me this to begin with, that they would run their copy through me if they wanted help with the story, and if they had a early date and had to get out fast, they'd try to run their copy through someone else, because I ultimately, I guess, was fairly supportive and interested in their copy, and would work with their copy and would explain to them why I was changing something or what needed to be fixed or what a problem was. So I don't know. I guess that goes back to women being nurturing. I don't know. I don't know.
Were there any women journalists you looked to as trailblazers?
No, not really, because it seems like, first of all, there weren't too many close to me. There were a couple of contemporaries. there was a woman named Christy Bradford who was my best friend, and I think one of the best journalists I ever met in my life. But we were pretty much contemporaries. I think we sort of learned a lot from each other. She ended up being the first woman managing editor of the Detroit News. The only other one that I can even think of, and I can't say, it was Marguerite Higgins, who had really blazed some trails as far as women war correspondents. And basically the reason I knew about her was because she had graduated from Berkeley, the same place that I'd gone to school. So I was aware of her and aware of her name. It wasn't until I started researching the book that I started finding out that there were a lot of heroines or heroes that I could have looked up to had I been aware. But I don't know, I just was sort of going along and doing what I did and doing what was in front of me, and not conscious at all of blazing any trails or even looking for role models.
You were called into service unexpectedly on April the 19th, 1995, when you were in Oklahoma City visiting your mom. Tell us about that day.
She was standing in the kitchen, and I was sort of standing between the kitchen and the living room, and something hit, and my mother said, a truck has hit this house. And I was like, no, you're in an interior garden apartment. That couldn't be. It must be something from Tinker Air Force Base. And I don't know. And then I just sort of knew somehow. And I walked over and turned on the television and just said, Mom, I gotta go.
And you became a journalist right at that moment
yeah,
again.
I mean, you know, you don't, if something happens, you go to work. It's just...
Absolutely. And we want to talk a moment about your mother, because she's a fascinating figure, was a barnstormer, and some people might not know what a barnstormer is. Explain.
I would think people in Oklahoma would know what a barnstormer is. She was flying around in an old World War I Jenny, which was the plane that they used to train pilots for in World War I. It was an open cockpit, biplane, to one wing on top of the other. And my father had gone to grammar school, was best friends with Paul Braniff. So my father was hanging out with all these guys, and I don't know, my mother, I think to show off or whatever, decided she wanted to fly. And there was a guy around by the name of Roy Hunt, who held the world's outside loop record. And so he became Mother's teacher. They tried to make her into a stunt pilot, but she really said she was always scared when she was flying upside down that she'd fall out.
Well, I think that's pretty reasonable fear.
Well, and she was the tiniest thing. I mean, I think she weighed 98 pounds when she delivered me, so Lord knows how much she weighed.
The following
before I was
community
born.
educational
And,
programming is an academic collaboration between Tulsa Community College and OSU Tulsa.
To my conception. She flew with a pillow behind her because those fuselages were sort of like, I went over not too long, when I was doing a story about her, I went over and looked at the Air Museum, and I was just amazed. Those fuselages were just sort of a hole, just a metal hole. And you got in there, and the seatbelt was too big, and so she wore a pillow behind her. And so when she was flying upside down, she always worried the pillow was going to slip out, and then she'd fall out. But anyway, she flew quite a bit and had some, she and my father both had wonderful tales about flying in the early days of Oklahoma.
She knew Wiley Post.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
Knew Wiley Post, and my father had stories about when Wiley cracked up the Jenny May and had it in Braniff's hangar to be fixed up, and Wiley didn't have enough money to pay the repair bill. So a lot of the mechanics around the field, a lot of people around the field collected that's one of my collected money for Wiley to pay for the repairs on his plane. I mean, that was one of my father's stories. My father had a million stories. He really had more stories than my mother did, but he was an Irish raconteur, so.
Figuratively speaking, did your mother teach you to fly high in your professional life?
Well, that's interesting. I never wanted to be a pilot. In fact, my father tried to get me to go out and be the youngest pilot, and I didn't want to have anything to do with it. But I think I probably totally learned from my mother to do what you want to do. Mm-hmm. I think that's why I don't
take some risks.
Yeah, no, I didn't have any kind of idea about going into journalism that you didn't belong there, because it just didn't occur to me.
I don't imagine that many of your friends had mothers who were barnstormers.
No, in fact, during the 60s, when women were throwing off their bras and chaining themselves to bumpers or whatever, fenders or whatever, I was like, well, what's this all about, At that point, I was sitting in the newsroom at the Yonkers Herald-Statesman all night by myself, dripping with sweat because there was no air conditioning, and I would spend all night writing 28 books of copy about what had happened at the city council meeting that night. So I just didn't pay all that much attention. If somebody said no, my favorite story of all time was the guy that sent me I sent out a resume to a radio station, and he sent me back a letter saying, call in for an audition, to make an appointment for an audition. And when I called, he heard my voice and he said, if you're a woman, lady, the deal's off.
Let's talk about your novel, The 5 O'Clock Follies. It's about a war correspondent, a female war correspondent, Angela, covering the Vietnam War. How much of your own experience informs her story?
Well, I would say an awful lot in the sense that after all those years, I worked for 5 different daily newspapers, and I worked for the Associated Press. So I kind of know how journalists think and how they operate under, most conditions. So I was able to extrapolate the journalism part of the novel. I had to do a tremendous amount of research for the Vietnam part, for the war part, but Angela has the problem that when she's sitting in the bar by herself, the guys won't sit next to her. But, that happened to girls on the high school bus. It's so you can use what you know.
Did you learn anything about the Vietnamese culture that surprised you as you were doing all your research?
Yeah, I finally went to Vietnam to double check my research. And one of the things that startled me the most was, even in that incredible heat in Saigon, a lot of the women wore white elbow-length gloves and big hats. Mm-hmm. And I asked somebody why, and it was because they didn't want their skin to get dark, which really totally startled me.
When you traveled to Vietnam, doing your research for this book, did you wonder what it would have been like? Do you wish you'd had this opportunity to go there and actually cover the war?
I lived with that research for so long that I absolutely felt I knew the area, I knew the place, I knew the so it's that's crazy, but it's almost not like I wished I had done it. It's almost as though I had. I lived in Angela's room in the Continental Hotel. I went to all the places. I found the hospital where she spent her time when she was injured. I sat in the cafe across from the entrance to the Continental and surveyed the scene. I went up to the bar at the top of the Caravel and sat there and drank like she did. Yeah, that was eerie. In fact, I kept thinking to myself, gosh, I didn't even realize until I got back that I had bought a pair of slacks and a jacket that was sort of the same color as the correspondents wore.
Mm-hmm. Do you think female correspondents bring a different perspective to war coverage?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that I didn't do that research for my novel because it's set during a very small period of time, but once I finished and now I've needed to talk about the book, I've started really looking at a lot of women correspondents, and it's amazing. Amazingly, there were more women accredited for World War II, which is a much short period of time than the Vietnam War, than there were for the whole length of time in Vietnam. But the women in World War II were very clearly sent to do feature stories, sob sister stories, and they only really began sending them when they found that the readers were really interested in these kinds of more featurey stories that were coming back, the stories about how the war was affecting. There's a segment in the book that happens with Angela when she talks a lot about how the sanitation problems were getting awful and the prostitution was getting awful in Saigon, and she goes and does some orphanage stories, and I got that directly from Martha Gellhorn, who went to Vietnam early on and did that very thing of writing stories about orphanages and hospitals and how the population was being affected. And the Vietnam government wouldn't give her a visa to come back. So absolutely, and this is not to say for one second that women can't cover combat just as well as men, but they also are much more inclined to do the feature story, do the human interest story, look at how the war is affecting the women and children and the sanitation problems. Mm-hmm. And the absolutely, it's I think there's no doubt about it.
We just have about a minute left, and I want you to talk about the title of the book, The 5 O'Clock Follies.
The title derives from the government press office held a press conference at 5 o'clock every day in Saigon, and the reporters didn't put a lot of stock in what they were finding, what they were getting at the press conferences, so they referred to it as the 5 O'Clock Follies. And this is completely, in some ways, what the book is almost about, is the difficulty the press had. They would go out to a battle scene and come back, and they were finding completely different information from what they were being handed. And in point of fact, the Vietnam War, they got off to a bad footing from the very beginning from 1961 on with the correspondence and the government.
Theasa, it's been so great having you with us today. Congratulations on the 5 O'Clock Follies, and thank all of you for joining us on Writing Out Loud.